It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday, grocery runs, a crowded parking lot, and nothing unusual. But when David Mitchell stepped out of his car, he had no idea his day would take a sharp and jarring turn. The shout came first. That was my spot. The voice, sharp and filled with anger, sliced through the afternoon air. David turned to see a woman storming toward him, her face twisted in fury. What started as a dispute over a parking space quickly escalated into a tense and hostile confrontation, her words dripping with entitlement and prejudice. A slap rang out, loud enough to echo across the rows of cars. The stunned crowd turned to see David standing firm, his cheeks stinging as he faced down a woman consumed by rage. What happened next would challenge his resolve, push his patience to its limits, and force him to stand up for his dignity in ways he never expected. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story of courage and justice, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful tale. David Mitchell had a simple plan for his Saturday afternoon. Grab a few groceries, maybe a coffee, and enjoy the warm sunshine. The bustling Harvest Mart parking lot was crowded, with cars weaving in and out of spaces as shoppers rushed to finish their weekend errands. DeVito was a few feet from the store entrance as he drove through the packed lot. He turned into the space with relief, carefully aligning his car within the painted lines. Lucky break, he thought, closing the car door behind him. He hadn't taken more than a step when a loud screech of tires made him pause. Turning toward the sound, David saw a white SUV pull up aggressively into the spot next to his car. The driver, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a face twisted in irritation, was already rolling her window down. "That was my spot," she yelled, pointing a finger at David with the force of a dagger. Startled, David blinked. "Excuse me?" he replied, his tone calm but confused. The woman, later identified as Linda Wilson, flung her car door open dramatically and stormed out. Her movements were sharp, her anger evident in every step. "I had my blinker on. I was waiting for that space," she hissed, standing mere inches from David. David glanced around the lot. He hadn't noticed anyone waiting when he parked. "I'm sorry," he said evenly. "I didn't see you there." The space looked open. Linda's eyes narrowed. She crossed her arms, her stance aggressive. "Of course you didn't see me." "People like you never do," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. The subtle jab wasn't lost on David. A familiar tightness crept into his chest, the kind he felt in such situations. It wasn't the first time he'd been targeted with veiled insults, and he doubted it would be the last. "I understand you're upset," he said after a pause, trying to de-escalate the situation. "It's just a parking spot." "I'm not trying to start anything here," Linda scoffed, her face contorting in exaggerated disbelief. "Not trying to start anything? You're already starting something by taking what doesn't belong to you. This is what people like you do, thinking the rules don't apply to you." David's fists clenched momentarily before he forced them to relax at his sides. He had learned long ago not to let anger dictate his actions, especially in public confrontations. He took a calming breath, though his heart thudded against his ribs. "Ma'am, I'll be in and out quickly." "You can have the spot when I leave," he offered, stepping back slightly to create distance between them. But Linda wasn't done. She stepped closer, her finger jabbing toward his chest. "People like you," she began, her voice rising, "come into places like this, thinking you can take whatever you want. I bet you don't even live around here." David's patience thinned. He maintained his composure, but couldn't help the edge that crept into his voice. "Where I live has nothing to do with this." "Oh, it has everything to do with it." Linda shot back, practically shouting now. "This is what happens when they let people like you into decent neighborhoods." David could feel the weight of the onlookers' stares. A small crowd had formed at a distance, their curiosity piqued by Linda's escalating tirade. He shook his head. "I'm not doing this," he said firmly, turning to walk toward the store. "It's not worth it." But Linda shoved him hard from behind before he could take more than a step. The unexpected force made David stumble, and he only caught himself before falling. Spinning around to face her, his voice snapped with controlled frustration. "What is wrong with you? You don't get to put your hands on me." Linda stood her ground, her chest heaving with rage. "Oh, I can do whatever I want. she spat. You think you can just walk away from me? I'm not done with you yet. David took another step back, his thoughts racing. He had seen situations like this play out before. He knew how quickly things could turn, how easily the narrative could shift against him. Walk away, he said, his voice low but firm. Before you do something you'll regret. Linda's lip curled in a sneer. Don't you tell me what to do, boy? The word hit David like a slap. It wasn't just an insult, a deliberate attempt to degrade and assert power over him. His hands clenched into fists so tight that his nails dug into his palms. Then, before he could react, Linda's hand lashed out, connecting with his face in a sharp, stinging slap. The sound echoed off the surrounding cars, leaving a heavy silence. David froze, the sting of the slap spreading across his cheek. Humiliation and anger warred within him as he processed what had just happened. He considered walking away for a moment, letting the situation end there. But something inside him rebelled. He couldn't let this pass without consequence. He raised his hand and slapped her back, not with the force of anger but with enough firmness to send a message. Enough. Linda staggered backward, her hand flying to her cheek as her eyes widened in disbelief. The silence shattered as she screamed, You hit me! You animal! Her voice rose shrill as she waved her arms frantically, drawing the attention of even more bystanders. You're going to pay for this. Do you know who I am? David stood his ground, his pulse pounding in his ears. You hit me first, he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. But Linda wasn't listening. She pointed at him, her face red with fury. He assaulted me, she shrieked. Someone call the police. David glanced at the crowd, his jaw tightening as he saw the judgment forming in their eyes. This wasn't going to end here. Not yet. David Mitchell stood frozen, the sting of Linda Wilson's slap fading into the background as the weight of her words and actions settled over him. The bystanders, their phones now out and recording, whispered among themselves, their faces a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. You think you can get away with this? Linda shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a trembling finger at David. You'll regret this. I'll ruin your life. David inhaled deeply, steadying himself. You hit me first, he repeated firmly, his voice carrying over her shouting. You don't get to play the victim here. Linda's reaction was immediate and theatrical. She gasped loudly, clutching her chest as if David's words had physically struck her. How dare you? She hissed, her voice thick with feigned indignation. People like you always think you can do whatever you want. David clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. Her words weren't new, echoes of countless microaggressions and blatant insults he'd endured over the years. But this was different. This was loud, public, and escalating by the second. I'm done with this, he said flatly, walking toward the store. You don't get to walk away from me. Linda screamed, stepping forward with wild energy. Not after what you've done. David didn't look back, his footsteps steady even as her voice rang behind him. The supermarket's automatic doors whooshed open, offering a brief respite from the chaos outside. The cool, air-conditioned interior starkly contrasted the heated confrontation, but David couldn't fully shake the tension in his chest. He gripped a shopping cart and pushed it down the first aisle, his hands tight around the handle. Every word Linda spat at him replayed in his mind, each stoking the fire of frustration he was trying so hard to contain. Focus, he muttered, scanning the shelves for the items on his list. Bread, milk, eggs. But even as he moved through the store, he couldn't escape the feeling that the confrontation wasn't over. There was a gnawing in his gut, a sense of unfinished business that made it hard to concentrate. When David finally returned to the parking lot with his groceries, the sight of his car made his stomach drop. Deep scratches marred the driver's side, jagged lines carved into the glossy paint as though someone had taken a key and dragged it with deliberate malice. He stopped in his tracks, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. No question had done this. Linda, he muttered under his breath, the name a bitter taste on his tongue. Walking closer, David ran his hand along the damage, feeling the grooves beneath his fingertips. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a message. A petty, vindictive act meant to provoke him further. His eyes scanned the parking lot, searching for her, half expecting to see her gloating nearby. Instead, he spotted her SUV a few spaces away. Linda was leaning against the driver's side door, her arms crossed and a smug smile curling her lips. "Oh, poor you," she called out mockingly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like someone doesn't know how to care for their car." David straightened, his jaw tight. "You did this," he said evenly, though his voice carried an edge of restrained anger. Linda shrugged, her grin widening. "Prove it," she taunted. "What are you going to do? Call the cops? Go ahead. I dare you." Her words were like gasoline on a fire. David could feel his composure fraying, but he took a steadying breath. He knew exactly what she wanted, for him to lose control and to give her more ammunition to twist the narrative in her favor. "I'm not playing your game," he said, turning away. But Linda wasn't finished. She climbed into her SUV, rolling down the window to yell after him. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" she sneered. "You're nothing, you hear me?" "Nothing." David didn't respond. He opened the trunk of his car and began loading his groceries, each movement deliberate as he fought to keep his temper in check. Then came the sound that made his blood run cold. The sudden roar of Linda's engine revving. Before David could react, her SUV lurched backward, slamming into the front of his car with a sickening crunch. The impact force shuddered through his vehicle, the sound of metal twisting and scraping echoing through the lot. David spun around, his heart pounding as he stared at the wreckage. Linda's SUV was still pressed against his car, her laughter spilling out the open window like a dark cloud. "You're insane," David said, his voice low but trembling with controlled fury. Linda smirked, her eyes glinting with malicious satisfaction. "And you're screwed," she replied, throwing her car into drive and speeding off. For a moment David stood there, frozen in disbelief. The damage to his car was undeniable, with a crumpled front bumper and paint scuffed and scraped away. But it wasn't just the physical damage that left him shaken. It was the sheer audacity of her actions, the unrelenting malice she carried out with such confidence. Reaching for his phone, David dialed 911. His hand shook as he held the device to his ear, his breath shallow as the last hour's events replayed in his mind. 911. "What's your emergency?" "I need to report an incident," David said, his voice steadier than he felt. "A woman just intentionally hit my car and drove off." The dispatcher asked for details, and David quickly described Linda's SUV, its make, model, and color, and gave his location. "Are you following her?" the dispatcher asked. David hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Linda's vehicle in the distance. "I am now," he said, climbing into his damaged car and starting the engine. "Keep your distance," the dispatcher instructed. "Officers are on their way." As David trailed Linda through the quiet suburban streets, his mind raced. He thought of the police and how they might perceive the situation. He thought of Linda's smug confidence, her belief that she could get away with anything. But more than anything, he thought of justice. David Mitchell kept a cautious distance behind Linda Wilson's SUV as she weaved through the quiet suburban streets. The crunch of metal against metal still echoed in his mind, a visceral reminder of her brazen act of aggression. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, knuckles white as adrenaline coursed through his veins. The dispatcher's voice crackled through his phone, still connected via speaker. "Sir, stay at a safe distance. Officers are en route and will intercept the vehicle shortly." David exhaled a shaky breath. "Understood. She's about 2 cars ahead of me now." As he followed Linda, flashes of doubt flickered through his mind. Would the police believe him? Or would they, like many others, accept her version of events without question? Linda had already shown her willingness to manipulate the narrative, to scream victim while casting him as the aggressor. But he shook the thoughts away, focusing on what he could control. He had called the police, provided details, and stayed calm despite the chaos she had caused. He had done everything right. Up ahead, Linda's SUV slowed at a red light. David's heart leaped as the flash of red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The patrol car sped past him and pulled in behind Linda's vehicle, its siren wailing briefly before cutting off. "She's been intercepted," David told the dispatcher, relief flooding his voice. "Good. Stay where you are and wait for the officers to speak with you," the dispatcher replied. Linda's SUV pulled to the curb, and David parked behind her. For a moment, he sat in his car, gathering himself. His hands were still trembling, the tension in his chest refusing to dissipate. When he finally stepped out, the officers were approaching Linda's vehicle. From where he stood, David could see her through the windshield, gesturing wildly and shouting at the officers. Even from a distance, her voice carried a shrill mix of anger and fury. "She hit me," Linda screamed as one officer leaned down to speak through the open window. "That man is following me. He's dangerous." David clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew what she was doing, trying to frame herself as the victim, as she had done from the beginning. One of the officers, a tall man with a steady demeanor, turned toward David. "Sir, are you the one who called this in?" "Yes," David replied, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I reported her for intentionally hitting my car and driving off. I have visible damage on my vehicle." The officer nodded, his expression neutral. "Can you describe what happened?" David recounted the events clearly and concisely, from the initial confrontation in the parking lot to the scratches on his car and the deliberate collision. As he spoke, he noticed Linda glaring at him through her side mirror, her face a mask of contempt. "She's lying." Linda's voice cut through the air, shrill and desperate. "He attacked me. He's been harassing me since the parking lot." David felt a flicker of anger but kept his tone measured. "She's the one who escalated this, officer. I called for help because I didn't want this to worsen." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a shorter woman inspecting the damage to David's car. After a moment, the female officer walked over, her expression serious. "There's significant damage to his car," she confirmed, gesturing toward the front bumper. "It's consistent with the kind of impact described." Linda's face turned crimson. "You're going to believe him over me?" she spat, glaring at the officers. "Look at me. I'm the victim here." "Ma'am," the male officer said calmly, "we'll need you to step out of the vehicle so we can continue our investigation." Linda's response was immediate and explosive. She slammed her fists against the steering wheel, her voice rising in a shrill crescendo. "This is ridiculous. I'm not the one who should be questioned. Arrest him." "Bookmark, step out of the vehicle, ma'am," the officer repeated, his tone firm but calm. Linda hesitated, her eyes darting between the officers and David. Then, with a dramatic huff, she flung the door open and climbed out, her movements sharp and theatrical. As the officers began asking her questions, Linda pointed repeatedly at David, her words rapid and chaotic. "He slapped me. He's been following me. I was defending myself." David stood quietly, letting the officers do their work. He knew better than to argue or interrupt, even as Linda's accusations grew more outlandish. Finally, the female officer walked back over to him. "Sir, we'll need a formal statement from you at the station," she said. "We'll also review any available security footage from the parking lot to corroborate your account." David nodded. "Of course. Thank you." As the officers turned their attention back to Linda, David watched her frustration boil over. Her face was flushed, her chest heaving as she continued her tirade. "You're doing this because of him," she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. "You're taking his side because you think he's innocent. But he's not. He's dangerous." The male officer's patience finally wore thin. "Ma'am, we have enough evidence to take you into custody for property damage and leaving the scene of an accident. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." The words hit Linda like a physical blow. Her eyes widened and she stood frozen in shock for a moment. Then she erupted. "No, this isn't happening," she screamed, lunging toward David with wild desperation. Her fists collided with his shoulder, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to stun him. The officers reacted immediately, grabbing her arms and pulling her back as she kicked and flailed, her screams echoing through the street. "You think you can ruin me?" Linda shrieked, her voice hoarse. "You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing." David took a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears as the officers struggled to restrain her. They quickly cuffed her hands behind her back, her furious thrashing gradually giving way to defeated sobs. As they led her toward the patrol car, Linda turned her head one last time, her eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed through gritted teeth. "I'll make you pay for this." David exhaled slowly, his body tense as he watched the squad car drive away, its siren blaring faintly in the distance. The male officer approached him again, his expression softening. "Are you all right, sir?" David nodded, though his voice was strained. "I'm fine. Just ready for this to be over." "We'll follow up with you about the charges," the officer said, handing David a card with his contact information. For now, take care of yourself." David thanked him and returned to his car. As he sat behind the wheel, staring at the scratches and dents that marred its once sleek exterior, he felt the weight of everything that had happened settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about a parking spot or a damaged car. It was about entitlement, prejudice, and the length some people would go to assert power over others. The sun was setting as David Mitchell walked into the local police station, his steps heavy with exhaustion. The weight of the day's events pressed down on him, but he knew he had to see this through. Linda Wilson had been taken into custody, but the formalities of pressing charges and recounting everything in detail awaited him. The station's interior was quiet, and the hum of computers and the faint murmur of officers in conversation created a strange sense of calm. Behind the front desk, a young officer looked up from her computer and greeted him with a polite smile. "Good evening," she said. "How can I help you?" David cleared his throat, his voice steady but tinged with wariness. "I'm here to give a formal statement about an incident earlier today. I was told to come in and press charges for property damage and assault." The officer nodded, reaching for a clipboard stacked with forms. "Of course. Please fill this out with your information and we'll have someone assist you shortly." David thanked her and took a seat in the waiting area, the clipboard balanced on his knee. As he filled out the form, his mind drifted back to the parking lot, to Linda's enraged face and the sound of metal crunching as she rammed her SUV into his car. He paused, his pen hovering over the page, as her parting words echoed in his mind. "I'll make you pay for this." Shaking his head, David forced himself to focus. This was about holding her accountable. For too long, people like Linda had gotten away with behavior like this, hiding behind privilege and feigned innocence. Not this time, he thought firmly as he finished the paperwork. "Mr. Mitchell?" David looked up to see Officer Reynolds, the tall, calm officer who had responded to the scene earlier. He stood in the doorway of a small office, holding a file in one hand. "That's me," David replied, standing. "Come with me," Reynolds said, motioning him into the office. The room was functional, with a desk, a computer, and a few chairs. David took a seat across from Reynolds, who began typing on the computer as he opened the file. "So you've decided to press charges against Ms. Wilson?" Reynolds asked, glancing up at him. "Yes," David said firmly. "She needs to be held accountable for what she did." Reynolds nodded. "You're making the right call. With the evidence we have, including the damage to your car, your initial statement, and what occurred during her arrest, we've got a solid case against her." Hearing the officer's reassurance gave David a sense of relief, though it didn't completely ease the tension in his chest. He still felt the sting of Linda's words, the sharpness of her slap, and the humiliation of being treated as if his humanity was something she could disregard. Reynolds continued, "Can you walk me through the incident again? Start from the moment you enter the parking lot." David recounted everything in detail, from finding the parking space to Linda's aggressive confrontation, her insults, and the slap that had ignited the escalation. He described the scratches on his car, her deliberate collision, and her erratic behavior when the officers arrived. Reynolds listened intently, occasionally typing notes or asking clarifying questions. When David finished, the officer leaned back in his chair, nodding thoughtfully. "It's clear she was trying to provoke you," Reynolds said, "but you handled yourself well. You didn't let her push you into escalating the situation further." David let out a short, humorless laugh. "It wasn't easy. Every instinct I had told me to walk away, but I couldn't just let her get away with it." "I understand," Reynolds said. "People like her thrive on pushing boundaries and relying on others to back down. You did the right thing by standing your ground and calling us." As Reynolds finalized the report, a voice echoed faintly from the hallway, a voice David recognized immediately. "You can't do this to me." His blood ran cold. Linda's voice, shrill and filled with indignation, carried through the station. A moment later, the door to the office burst open, and there she was. Her face was red with fury, her eyes wild as she struggled against the officer escorting her. "You!" She spat, her gaze locking onto David like a laser. "You're trying to ruin my life." David stood instinctively, his body tensing as Linda lunged toward him. The officer holding her quickly pulled her back, but she continued to thrash, her words tumbling out in a venomous tirade. "This is all your fault," she screamed. "You think you've won? You're nothing. Nothing. Miss Wilson, that's enough," the escorting officer barked, tightening his grip on her arms. Reynolds stood as well, his expression sharp as he stepped between Linda and David. "Take her back to holding," he ordered. The other officer nodded, dragging Linda toward the hallway as she continued to scream incoherently. David sat back down, his heart pounding as the sound of Linda's voice faded. Even in custody, her rage burned as brightly as it had in the parking lot. Reynolds sighed, shaking his head as he returned to his chair. "Sorry about that. She's here for her arraignment. I didn't expect her to be brought in so soon." David managed a faint smile, though his nerves were still raw. "Does she even realize what she's done? Or is she really convinced this is all my fault?" Reynolds shrugged. "Hard to say. Some people can't see past their own entitlement, but don't let her words get to you. The evidence speaks for itself." David nodded, though the weight of Linda's venomous words still clung to him. Reynolds handed him a printed copy of the report. "Here's your statement for your records. We'll be submitting everything to the district attorney's office. You'll be notified about the next steps, but with the evidence we've gathered, I don't see why they wouldn't move forward with charges." "Thank you," David said sincerely, shaking the officer's hand. "Just doing my job," Reynolds replied with a small smile. "Take care, Mr. Mitchell, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." David left the station, stepping out into the cool night air. For a moment, he stood on the steps, inhaling deeply as he tried to clear his mind. Justice was moving forward, but the encounter had left a mark far deeper than the scratches on his car. Linda's hatred, her entitlement, and her unrelenting attempts to frame herself as the victim were reminders of the uphill battle he faced every day as a black man in a world that often refused to see him as equal. But as he walked toward his car, David resolved to see this through to the end. Linda would face the consequences of her actions, and if nothing else, it would be a step toward holding people like her accountable. Weeks passed, but the events of that chaotic Saturday lingered in David Mitchell's mind. The scratches on his car had been repaired, but the memory of Linda Wilson's venomous words and unprovoked aggression was harder to erase. Today, however, felt like a turning point. David stood outside the courthouse, the imposing building looming above him as he prepared to take the next step, facing Linda in court. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet anticipation. Rows of benches lined the courtroom, a handful of spectators already seated. At the front, the judge's bench stood high above the room, exuding authority. David made his way to a seat behind the prosecution's table, where his attorney, Lauren Hayes, greeted him with a firm handshake and a reassuring smile. "You ready for this?" Lauren asked, her voice steady and confident. David nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Across the room, Linda sat at the defense table. Her demeanor a far cry from the wild, unhinged energy she had displayed at the police station. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But her eyes, those same eyes that had burned with hatred, still carried a glint of defiance. "Don't let her rattle you," Lauren said, noticing where David's gaze had settled. "Just focus on the facts. The evidence is on our side." The sound of a gavel brought the room to attention. "All rise," the bailiff called, as Judge Patricia Simmons entered. A woman of sharp features and an air of no-nonsense authority, Judge Simmons was known for her fairness and her intolerance for theatrics. "Be seated," she instructed, her voice firm but calm. David sat, his pulse steady but his mind racing. This was it. The trial would determine whether Linda would finally be held accountable for her actions. The prosecution began with its opening statement. Lauren Hayes rose from her seat, her presence commanding yet composed. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice clear and deliberate. "This case is not about a misunderstanding or a heated argument. It is about a deliberate pattern of aggression and entitlement that culminated in acts of violence and property damage." Lauren laid out the sequence of events, from Linda's verbal assault in the parking lot to the physical attack and the deliberate collision with David's car. She emphasized the evidence, the damage to the vehicle, witness statements, and Linda's erratic behavior when the police arrived. Mr. Mitchell did everything in his power to de-escalate the situation, Lauren continued, her tone unwavering. He remained calm and composed despite being provoked at every turn. Yet Miss Wilson chose to escalate, crossing lines that should never be crossed. We are here today because actions have consequences, and Miss Wilson must be held accountable for hers. David felt a small surge of confidence as Lauren sat down. Her words had been powerful, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. The defense attorney, a gray-haired man with a soft, measured voice, stood next. He introduced himself to the jury before turning his attention to Linda's version of events. Miss Wilson deeply regrets the events that transpired, he began, glancing toward her. She acted out of frustration and poor judgment, but we must remember that she, too, is human. She is a mother, a neighbor, and a long-standing member of this community. This incident was not representative of her character, but rather an isolated moment in an otherwise law-abiding life. David's jaw tightened. The defense's strategy was clear. Paint Linda as a victim of circumstance, a person who had simply made a mistake in the heat of the moment. The trial moved forward with the presentation of evidence. The prosecution called several witnesses to the stand, starting with a middle-aged man who had been in the parking lot that day. "I saw the whole thing," the man, Jeffrey Caldwell, testified. Miss Wilson was yelling at Mr. Mitchell, getting right in his face. When he tried to walk away, she shoved him and then slapped him. He didn't do anything until she hit him first. "And what was Mr. Mitchell's reaction?" Lauren asked. "It was measured," Jeffrey said firmly. He slapped her back, but it wasn't out of anger. It seemed like a reflex, like he just wanted her to stop. The jury listened intently, their faces thoughtful as Jeffrey recounted the escalation. Next came the video footage from the supermarket's parking lot cameras. The grainy black and white images showed Linda's aggressive approach, her push, the slap, and finally, the collision with David's car. "This footage corroborates Mr. Mitchell's account," Lauren explained as the video played. "It provides clear evidence of Ms. Wilson's actions, including the deliberate damage to Mr. Mitchell's vehicle." Linda's expression remained stoic, but David could see the tension in her clenched jaw and tightly clasped hands. When it was Linda's turn to testify, she approached the stand with deliberate slowness, her head held high. Her lawyer guided her through a series of questions designed to elicit sympathy. "I was having a terrible day," Linda began, her voice trembling slightly. "When I saw the parking spot, I thought, finally something's going right. But then he pulled in out of nowhere. I lost my temper, and I regret it deeply." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the jury. "But I wasn't the only one who escalated things. Mr. Mitchell slapped me too. I wasn't the only one who reacted poorly." Lauren's cross-examination was swift and precise. "Miss Wilson, you admit that you slapped Mr. Mitchell first?" Lauren asked. Linda hesitated, her bravado faltering. "Yes, but meth. And you also admit to scratching his car and deliberately colliding with it later?" "I," Linda stammered, her eyes darting toward her lawyer. "Answer the question, Miss Wilson," Lauren pressed. "Yes," Linda muttered finally, her voice barely audible. Lauren turned to the jury. "There you have it. Miss Wilson's own admission confirms what the evidence and witnesses have already shown. Her actions were deliberate and malicious, not the result of a mere bad day." David watched as the jury absorbed Lauren's words. He couldn't read their expressions, but he felt a glimmer of hope. The trial concluded with closing arguments. Lauren's statement was sharp and unyielding, emphasizing the importance of accountability and the harm caused by Linda's actions. The defense's closing argument appealed to emotion, asking the jury to consider Linda's remorse and the impact a conviction might have on her life. Hours later, the jury returned with their verdict. David's heart pounded as the foreperson stood and read aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Linda Wilson, guilty of assault and property damage." Linda's face paled, her composure finally cracking as the weight of the words settled on her. She sank into her chair, her hands trembling. Relief washed over David, but it was bittersweet. Justice had been served, yet the pain of what had happened lingered. This wasn't just about one confrontation. It was about the broader reality of prejudice and entitlement that had led to it in the first place. The courtroom emptied quickly after the verdict was read. Linda Wilson sat frozen at the defense table, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly as the weight of the jury's decision settled over her. David Mitchell, on the other hand, remained in his seat for a moment, his body still, his mind racing. It was over. After weeks of preparation, countless relived memories, and a storm of emotions, justice had been served. Linda had been found guilty of assault and property damage, and the world now knew what she had done. Yet, as David rose from his seat, he felt far from victorious. The courtroom's heavy doors swung shut behind him as he stepped out into the sunlight. A cool breeze brushed against his face, and for a moment he paused on the courthouse steps, his hands gripping the railing as he inhaled deeply. "It's done," he murmured to himself, but the words felt hollow. Lauren Hayes, the sharp and determined prosecutor who had stood by his side throughout the trial, approached him with a small, knowing smile. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her tone professional but tinged with genuine concern. David shrugged, glancing down at the concrete beneath his feet. "Relieved, I guess, but not as much as I thought I'd be." Lauren nodded, crossing her arms. "That's understandable. Court victories in cases like this are always bittersweet. It's about more than just a verdict, isn't it?" David sighed, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, it's not just about Linda, it's about everything she represents. People like her don't go away just because a jury says they're guilty. And honestly, I'm not sure she's learned anything from this." Lauren tilted her head thoughtfully. "You're probably right. But standing up for yourself still matters, David. You've set an example, not just for yourself, but for others who might be in similar situations. It's not an easy thing to do." David managed a faint smile. "Thanks, Lauren. For everything. I don't think I could have done this without you." "You're welcome," she replied. "Take care of yourself, okay? And remember, if you ever need anything, you can always reach out." With that, she gave him a polite nod and headed back toward the courthouse. David remained on the steps, watching as people bustled past, going about their lives as if nothing monumental had just happened. For them, it was just another day. For David, it was a turning point, a moment that would stay with him long after the case faded from memory. He descended the steps and walked to his car, the very one at the center of the storm that had unfolded weeks ago. The scratches and dents had been repaired, but every time he saw the vehicle, he couldn't help but think of Linda's venomous words, the slap, and the deliberate collision that had pushed him to his breaking point. As he slid into the driver's seat, David caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back at him looked weary, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But there was something else there, too. Resolve. Driving home, the city streets passed by in a blur. His mind churned with thoughts of the trial, replaying every word, every argument, every accusation Linda had hurled his way. She had fought so hard to paint herself as the victim, to twist the narrative and shift the blame. And while the jury hadn't bought her lies, David couldn't shake the bitterness that lingered. People like Linda didn't exist in isolation. Her entitlement, her hatred, her belief that she could do whatever she wanted without consequence. It wasn't just her. It was a reflection of something deeper, something pervasive that he had encountered time and time again. It wasn't just the blatant acts of racism that weighed on him. It was the subtle moments, too. The way cashiers watched him more closely when he shopped. The way strangers hesitated before sitting next to him on public transportation. And the way assumptions about his character preceded him wherever he went. Linda's actions had been an extreme example, but they were part of a pattern, one that stretched back through history and continued to permeate the present. As David pulled into his driveway, he let out a long breath. His home, a modest but cozy space, stood as a reminder of his hard work and resilience. It was a place where he could finally let his guard down. He stepped inside, setting his keys on the kitchen counter and collapsing onto the couch. The quiet of the room enveloped him, a stark contrast to the tension and noise of the courtroom. For a moment, he let himself feel the relief, the simple, undeniable fact that Linda had been held accountable. But it was fleeting, overshadowed by the larger reality of the world he lived in. He thought about the countless stories he had heard from friends, family, and colleagues, stories of discrimination, of being underestimated, of having to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. Standing up to Linda had been the right thing to do, but it hadn't been easy. It had taken a toll, not just physically, but emotionally. And while the trial was over, David knew the fight wasn't. The fight against prejudice, against entitlement, against a system that so often failed to protect people like him, that fight was far from over. But tonight, at least, he could rest. He reached for his phone, scrolling through messages of support from friends and family who had followed the case. Their words brought a small measure of comfort, a reminder that he wasn't alone. One message from his younger sister, Aya, stood out. "Proud of you, big bro. What you did today matters. Don't ever forget that." David smiled faintly, his chest tightening with emotion. He didn't feel like a hero, but her words reminded him that his actions had ripple effects far beyond the courtroom. As he closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day wash over him, David allowed himself a moment of peace. Tomorrow, the world will keep turning, and the challenges will remain. But for now, he had done what he could. Justice had been served, and that would have to be enough. The days after the trial were a whirlwind of emotions for David Mitchell. News of the case spread quickly, particularly after local outlets picked up the story. "Man stands up to racist attack in parking lot confrontation," one headline read. While David hadn't sought public attention, the story resonated with many who had experienced similar injustices or feared confronting them. Friends and family reached out in droves, their messages of support flooding his phone. Coworkers stopped by his desk to offer kind words, and his sister Maya called every day to check. "You're making a difference," she said during one of their calls. People need to hear stories like this. It's a reminder that we don't have to take this kind of behavior lying down. David appreciated her words, but they didn't entirely lift the weight he carried. The trial had ended, and Linda Wilson had been found guilty, but the scars of the confrontation ran deeper than the courtroom verdict. One afternoon, David sat at his dining table, scrolling through social media posts about the case. Most comments were supportive, praising him for his composure and determination. "Finally, someone is standing up to these entitled people," one post read. Another wrote, "This is what accountability looks like. We need more of this." But there were also detractors. People who questioned his actions, accused him of overreacting, or worse, painted him as the aggressor. "If he just walked away, none of this would have happened," one commenter wrote, the words digging into David like tiny barbs. He knew better than to let the negativity get to him, but it was a reminder of the world he lived in. A world where even in the face of blatant injustice, he was still expected to remain silent, to endure without resistance. David leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to the faces of the jury as they delivered their verdict. There had been a sense of justice in that moment, but it was fleeting. Linda's hatred and entitlement were larger than just one person. The systemic issues that allowed people like her to feel emboldened to act out their prejudices weren't something a single trial could fix. And yet, this was a step. A small one, but a step nonetheless. A week later, David was approached by a local community group focused on racial justice and advocacy. They invited him to speak at one of their events, a panel discussion about standing up to discrimination. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he had ever been comfortable with, and the idea of reliving the events in front of an audience felt daunting. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the importance of sharing his story. On the evening of the event, David sat on stage with 3 other panelists, each with their own experiences of confronting prejudice. The audience was a mix of ages and backgrounds, and their faces were attentive as the moderator introduced the speakers. When it was David's turn to speak, he adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. "I never wanted to be in the position I found myself in that day," he began. "I didn't wake up thinking I'd be the target of someone else's anger, someone else's entitlement. But when it happened, I had a choice to make. I could have walked away and let it slide, or I could stand up for myself." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience. Standing up wasn't easy. It came with risks. I knew how quickly the narrative could turn against me, how easily I could be painted as the villain. But I also knew that if I didn't stand up, I'd be letting her win, not just for me, but for everyone she's ever treated that way. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. "I'm not here to tell you that standing up to injustice is easy or that it always ends in a courtroom victory. But I am here to tell you that it matters. Every time we push back, every time we refuse to let people like Linda think they can get away with this kind of behavior, we chip away at the systems that enable them. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. People approached him afterward, sharing their own stories of discrimination and thanking him for his courage. For the first time since the trial, David felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that his experience could be a catalyst for change. In the weeks that followed, David continued to engage with the community, attending workshops and discussions about racial equity and justice. Each interaction, each shared story, reminded him that he wasn't alone in his struggles. But change wasn't just happening on a large scale. It was happening in smaller, quieter ways, too. One evening, as David was leaving the grocery store, he noticed a man struggling with a heavy box in the parking lot. Without hesitation, David walked over to help. The man, who introduced himself as Frank, thanked him profusely. As they loaded the box into Frank's car, the older man paused, his expression thoughtful. "I recognize you," he said. "You're the guy from that trial, the one who stood up to that woman." David smiled faintly. "Yeah, that was me." Frank extended a hand. "What you did? It took guts. And it made people like me think twice about staying silent when we see something wrong. So, thank you." David shook his hand, a warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the small ripples of change that spread outward, touching lives in ways he might never fully understand. Back at home, David sat on his couch, reflecting on the journey he'd been on since that fateful day in the parking lot. He thought about the trial, the public attention, and the conversations he'd had with people from all walks of life. The fight against prejudice and injustice was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of hope. Hope that his actions have made a difference. Hope that others might feel empowered to stand up for themselves. And hope that one day, the world might be a little kinder, a little fairer. As he leaned back, letting the quiet of the evening settle around him, David realized something important. While he couldn't change the world overnight, he could keep fighting. And for now, that was enough. The evening was unusually still. David Mitchell sat on his back porch, a mug of herbal tea warming his hands as he gazed at the stars. The faint hum of the city in the distance served as a reminder of life moving on, yet his thoughts remained tethered to everything that had unfolded over the past few months. The trial was behind him, and Linda Wilson had been held accountable, yet the experience continued to cast a long shadow. It wasn't just the confrontation itself. It was the weight of realizing how deeply entrenched prejudice still was in the world around him. But tonight, under the vastness of the sky, David allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The quiet wasn't just external, it was something he felt within himself, a growing sense of resolution. David thought back to that moment in the parking lot, the slap that had ignited the firestorm. It wasn't the physical sting that had stayed with him. It was the way it symbolized Linda's belief that she could diminish him, that her anger gave her the right to strip him of his dignity. He hadn't realized just how deeply it had affected him until long after the trial. For weeks, the memory of her voice, sharp, cutting, filled with entitlement, had haunted him. Every interaction he had with strangers felt tinged with suspicion, as if he was waiting for someone else to treat him the way she had. And yet, David knew he couldn't live his life consumed by anger or fear. What Linda had done was her burden to bear, her flaw to reckon with. He refused to let it define him. Instead, he focused on what he had learned, not just about the world, but about himself. The confrontation had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It forces us to confront not only Linda's blatant racism, but also the internal struggle of deciding how to respond. For so long, he had been conditioned to avoid conflict, to let slights and microaggressions roll off his back for the sake of preserving peace. But in that parking lot, something had shifted. He had realized that walking away wasn't always the answer, that sometimes standing firm was the only way to reclaim his agency. It wasn't easy. Standing up to Linda had been terrifying, especially when he considered how quickly the narrative could have turned against him. He had seen it happen before. A black man defending himself only to be labeled the aggressor. But he had chosen to push past that fear, and in doing so, he had discovered a well of resilience he hadn't known he possessed. "I did the right thing," he whispered to himself, the words a quiet affirmation. One of the most unexpected outcomes of the trial had been the connections David had formed with others. The support he had received from his family, friends, and even strangers had reminded him that he wasn't alone in his experiences. Through the community events and discussions he had attended, he had met people from all walks of life, people who had faced their own battles against prejudice and who understood the pain and frustration of being seen as less than. These interactions had been healing in a way David hadn't anticipated. They had reminded him that change was possible, even if it came slowly and in small increments. He thought about Maya's words during one of their recent phone calls. "It's not about fixing everything at once. It's about planting seeds, one conversation at a time, one act of courage at a time." David smiled faintly, the memory of her encouragement warming him. She was right. As he sipped his tea, David opened the notebook resting on the small table beside him. Over the past few weeks, he had begun writing down his thoughts and reflections on the trial, the confrontation, and the broader issues of racism and justice. It wasn't something he planned to share publicly, at least not yet. For now, it was, for him, a way to process everything he had been through, to make sense of the emotions that still lingered. He flipped to a blank page and began to write. "Linda tried to make me feel small, but her actions only revealed her own weakness. Standing up to her wasn't just about holding her accountable. It was about reclaiming my voice. It was about reminding myself that I deserved to exist in this world without fear, without shame, without compromise." The words flowed easily, each stroke of the pen bringing a sense of clarity. Writing had become a form of catharsis, a way for David to take control of the narrative instead of letting it control him. As the night deepened, David found his thoughts drifting toward the future. The trial had been a pivotal moment, but it wasn't the end of his journey. If anything, it sparked a desire to do more, to use his voice and his experiences to create meaningful change. He wasn't sure what that would look like yet. Maybe it would mean continuing to speak at community events or volunteering with organizations focused on racial equity. Maybe it would mean mentoring younger generations, helping them navigate the challenges he had faced. What he did know was that he wanted to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others who might feel powerless in the face of injustice. As the stars glittered overhead, David closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. The tea in his mug had gone cold, but he didn't mind. The stillness of the night, the weight of his reflections, felt grounding. Linda Wilson might never fully understand the harm she had caused, and there would always be others like her, people who acted out of hatred, entitlement, or ignorance. But David knew he couldn't control that. What he could control was how he chose to respond, and how he chose to live his life in the face of those challenges. Tonight, his resolve felt stronger than ever. Tomorrow, he would continue to move forward, not out of anger, but out of determination. He would continue to stand up, to speak out, to be a force for change in whatever way he could. And that, he realized, was enough. David Mitchell's story is more than just a confrontation in a parking lot. It's a testament to resilience, courage, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. His decision to confront Linda Wilson, take justice, and tell her accountable wasn't an easy one. It required patience, composure, and the willingness to endure public scrutiny. At its core, this story highlights the power of perseverance. David could have chosen to walk away, to let the insults and aggression slide. But by taking a stand, he not only protected his dignity, but also sent a message to others. Prejudice and entitlement have no place in our society, and actions have consequences. For many, David's journey is a reflection of a larger struggle, the fight against systemic biases and everyday injustices that so often go unchallenged. It's a reminder that progress isn't achieved in grand gestures alone, but in the accumulation of small, meaningful acts of defiance and resilience. Linda's behavior, fueled by hatred and a misguided sense of superiority, serves as a stark reminder of the work still left to be done. Her attempt to manipulate the narrative and frame herself as the victim mirrors the broader challenges faced by marginalized communities who are often forced to defend their humanity against deeply ingrained stereotypes. But David's courage also shows us the flip side of that struggle: the possibility for change, accountability, and inspiring others to stand up against similar injustices. His actions, though born from personal necessity, resonated far beyond the confines of his own experience. The lessons from this story are clear. We must be vigilant against prejudice in all its forms, whether it's overt or subtle. We must support those who face discrimination and amplify their voices. And most importantly, we must remember that standing up for justice, no matter how small the act may seem, creates ripples of change that can inspire others to do the same. This isn't just David's story, it's a call to action for all of us. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Did it inspire you? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand up for yourself or someone else? Tell us your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and sharing your experience could inspire someone else to take a stand. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this one. Let's keep the conversation going and build a community that values respect, empathy, and justice. Share your thoughts below, and thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we can create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and equality.